The paper shook in his hands. Not from age, not from the wind cutting through the cracked window of that kitchen in Boone County, Iowa. It shook because Earl Hagedorn, a man who had not cried at his own father's funeral, a man who had pulled a calf from a frozen ditch at 2 in the morning without flinching, was holding back something that had been building for 3 years. It was March of 1987. The bill on the table was for $4,217. For a tractor he already owned. He set it down, he looked out at the field, and then he did something nobody in Boone County expected. He smiled. Let me tell you about a place. Boone County, Iowa, spring of 1987. You have to see it the way it was, not the way nostalgia softens it, but the way it actually felt to the people living inside it. The farm crisis had been chewing through the Midwest like a slow fire through dry hay. Between 1981 and 1987, more than 300,000 American farms had been lost. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, families that had worked the same land for 4 generations watching auction signs go up in their own front yards. In Iowa alone, farm debt had ballooned to catastrophic levels, and land values that had soared in the 1970s had collapsed, some counties losing 60% of their farmland value in less than a decade. Boone County sat in the center of the state, corn and soybean country, the kind of place where the roads run straight as rulers and the sky comes all the way down to the earth at the edges. In March, the fields were still bare, dark and wet from snowmelt, carrying the smell of iron and cold mud and something underneath that, something organic and ancient, the smell of land getting ready. The town of Ogden, population just under 2,000, had a grain elevator, a hardware store, a diner called Millie's that served coffee in white ceramic mugs with no handles, and a John Deere dealership on the south end of Main Street called Crater Farm Equipment. That dealership and the man who ran it are central to this story. But first, Earl. Earl Hagedorn was 53 years old in 1987, and he looked 65. That's not an insult, that's the math of a life lived outdoors in seasons in labor. His hands were the color of old leather and had the texture of bark. His face had been creased by 10,000 Iowa sunsets. He stood 5'10" but carried himself slightly forward, the permanent lean of a man who has spent decades walking into wind. He had grown up on the same 240 acres his grandfather had broken in 1911. Didn't go to college, not because he wasn't smart, but because in 1952, when Earl was 18, his father's back gave out and someone had to run the combine. Earl ran it, and he just kept running it, year after year, season after season. He'd married Dorothy Kunkel in 1957. They'd had 3 kids. 2 of the kids moved to Des Moines, 1 to Minnesota. The farm in the way of farms was too much work to leave, but not quite enough income to justify staying. So it was just Earl and Dorothy now, and Earl's dog, a red heeler named Sputnik, who rode in the cab of the tractor and seemed to understand weather better than the radio. Earl drove a 1971 John Deere 4020, dark green, scratched and sun-faded with a cracked rubber steering wheel he'd wrapped in electrical tape twice. That tractor had 11,000 hours on it. Earl had put most of those hours on himself. He knew that machine the way a surgeon knows a patient, every sound, every vibration, every hesitation. He wasn't rich, the farm crisis had squeezed him like everyone else. But he was not desperate either, because Earl Hagedorn had made a decision back in 1979 that most of his neighbors had not. He had refused to borrow against inflated land prices. He had stayed small. He had kept his equipment old and paid for. He was not fashionable. He was not impressive at the coffee counter at Millie's. He wore the same Carhartt coat for 11 years. He brought his own lunch in a wax paper bag. But he knew something. He'd known it for years, quietly, the way certain people carry knowledge like a tool they don't yet need, waiting for the moment when the right situation arrives. That moment arrived on a Thursday morning in March of 1987, when he opened a service bill from Crater Farm Equipment. Let me tell you about Gary Crater. Gary was 41 in 1987, second-generation dealer, had taken over Crater Farm Equipment from his father Roy in 1979. Just in time, as Gary liked to say, to ride the wave. He had ridden it, new building, new lot, expanded service bays. During the land boom, Gary had sold John Deere equipment to half of Boone County on credit arrangements that looked irresistible in 1979, and felt like a trap by 1983. He was not a cruel man. Let me be careful here. Gary Crater was the kind of man who believed deeply and sincerely in a particular version of progress, the version where newer was better, bigger was smarter, and anyone still driving equipment from the early 1970s was making a choice rooted in stubbornness rather than sense. He wore a John Deere ball cap that was always clean. He drove a 1986 Chevy Silverado, green and yellow, with Crater Farm equipment on the doors. He had soft hands and a firm handshake, the handshake of a salesman, not a farmer. He was generous at the Chamber of Commerce, bought the Little League team their jerseys 2 years running, and genuinely could not understand why some of the older farmers in the county looked at him the way they did. He called old equipment liabilities. He called farmers who repaired their own machines part swappers. When someone came in asking about servicing a tractor more than 15 years old, his service manager, a wiry young man named Denton Pryor, would write up the estimate and Gary would review it, and almost always he'd say the same thing. "At some point, friend, you're just shoveling money into a hole." He said it with a smile, he meant it as advice. But in a room full of men who had nothing left but their old machines and their knowledge of how to fix them, those words had a way of landing like a slap. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been handed a bill that was clearly, obviously, deliberately wrong, and known that the person handing it to you expected you to just pay it? That's what Earl Hagedorn held in his kitchen that Thursday morning. The bill from Crater Farm Equipment itemized service on Earl's 4020, specifically a hydraulic pump rebuild and a fuel injection line replacement. Earl had brought the tractor in 6 days earlier after the hydraulic pressure began dropping inconsistently, standard wear he'd thought. He'd done it himself twice before in the 1970s. The bill read $4,217. Line by line, $380 for the hydraulic pump rebuild kit, $210 for fuel line parts, $1,100 in labor, 11 hours at $100 an hour, and then, at the bottom, a line item that stopped Earl cold. Diagnostic Systems Integration Update Proprietary Electronic Calibration, $2,527. Earl read that line 4 times. His 4020 didn't have electronic calibration. It was a 1971 tractor. It had points ignition and mechanical injection. There was nothing on that machine that could receive an electronic calibration of any kind. It would be like billing a man for a software update on a horse. He folded the bill into his coat pockets. He drove to Ogden. He walked into Crater Farm Equipment at 9:15 in the morning. The waiting area smelled like new rubber flooring and coffee from a drip machine nobody had cleaned in a week. 2 other farmers were already there, Walt Gruber from the Gruber operation east of town, and Pete Lindeman, who ran a smaller place out near Beaver. They nodded at Earl. He nodded back. Gary Crater came out from the back, rubbing his hands on a shop rag he'd never actually used on anything greasy. "Earl, here to settle up. Here to ask about this line item." Earl put the bill on the counter and tapped the bottom entry. Gary looked at it, didn't miss a beat. "Electronic calibration. We run that on every piece of equipment that comes through the service bay now, new county standard." "There's no such standard," Earl said. His voice was flat, not angry, just flat. "It's a proprietary diagnostic integration. Keeps your systems running optimally." "Gary," Earl's voice stayed level, "that tractor doesn't have electronic systems. It has a mechanical fuel pump and a points distributor. You cannot electronically calibrate something that has no electronics." Walt Gruber behind Earl made a quiet sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt. Acknowledgement. Gary smiled the smile of a man who has given this speech before. "Earl, I understand it sounds technical. That's why we have trained technicians. Now, if you want to dispute the bill, I can have Denton." "I'll pay the labor," Earl said. "I'll pay the parts. I won't pay $2,500 for a service that cannot physically be performed on my machine." The smile didn't waver. "Then I'm afraid we'll need to hold the tractor until the balance is settled. That's our policy." Silence in the waiting room. Walt Gruber set his coffee mug down. "My 4020 is in your lot," Earl said. "It is. Planting is 6 weeks out." "I understand that." Earl looked at Gary Crater for a long moment. Then he picked up the bill, folded it back into his pocket, and said one sentence before he turned and walked out. "All right then." Not a threat, not a promise, just all right then. Walt Gruber followed him out to the parking lot. "What are you gonna do, Earl?" Earl looked out at the flat gray sky, at the bare fields running to the horizon, at the town of Ogden sitting quiet and cold in early March. "What I should have done 10 years ago," he said. Now, this is the part of the story that requires some explanation, because what Earl Hagedorn did next didn't look dramatic. It didn't look like anything, really, to anyone watching. He went home, he went to his workshop. Let me describe that workshop because it matters. It was a 40 by 60 pole barn Earl's father had built in 1948, added to twice since. The floor was concrete, stained dark with decades of oil. Every wall was shelved, and on those shelves were parts organized not alphabetically, not by any system you'd recognize, but by a system Earl had developed across 35 years of fixing his own equipment. He could find a 1967 John Deere 3020 Governor spring in the dark by memory. On a workbench against the north wall were three things that nobody outside Earl's family had ever paid particular attention to: a cardboard box of handwritten notebooks, a set of factory service manuals for every piece of equipment he'd ever owned, and a small library of agricultural bulletins from the University of Iowa Extension Service going back to 1954. Earl had been collecting repair knowledge the way other men collected grievances, quietly, obsessively, across a lifetime. But that wasn't the secret, not exactly. The real knowledge Earl had was this: he understood with unusual clarity exactly what the shift in farm equipment had done to the average farmer's ability to maintain his own machinery. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, equipment manufacturers had increasingly moved toward proprietary parts, specialized tools and service manuals that were either expensive to obtain or simply not made available to individual owners. By the mid-1980s, some of the newer John Deere equipment required dealer-specific diagnostic computers just to read fault codes. The farmer who bought a new 4440 in 1983 was not just buying a tractor, he was buying a dependency. Earl had watched this happen. He had talked about it at the coffee counter at Millie's, and men had nodded and then gone back to their receipts and not thought too hard about it. Because when times are good and credit is easy, dependency doesn't feel like a trap, it feels like convenience. But Earl had also noticed something else, something specific and practical, and it turned out enormously valuable. Older equipment, the machines from the late 1950s through the early 1970s, were almost entirely serviceable without specialized tools. The John Deere 4020, the 3020, the 4010, the Oliver 1850, the International 806, these were machines designed in an era when the assumption was that a farmer would maintain his own equipment. The parts were not proprietary. The tolerances were documented. The service procedures were written in plain language. And parts for those machines were still manufactured, not by John Deere but by independent suppliers. Companies like Reliance Parts, High Capacity, and a network of smaller regional suppliers that the big dealerships had quietly stopped mentioning. A hydraulic pump rebuild kit for a 4020 that Crater Farm Equipment billed at $380. Earl knew exactly where to get it for $67. That was the knowledge, not exotic, not secret in any dramatic sense, just known, hoarded, and ready. But Earl had one more thing, one thing he'd been sitting on for almost 3 years. In his back equipment shed, under 2 tarps and a layer of dust that had been settling since 1984, sat a machine that most people in Boone County didn't know he owned. A 1968 John Deere 4520, high clearance, turbo, one of only a few thousand ever built. Earl had bought it at an estate auction in Madison County in the fall of 1984 for $2,100 from an executor who didn't know what he had. It had a cracked block and a seized turbocharger, and the PTO housing was cracked. Earl had spent 3 winters fixing it in the evenings slowly, the way you do a thing when you're doing it right. That machine, as of March 1987, was running. And it was running better than anything Crater Farm Equipment had sold in the last 5 years. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone who was very good at something decide, for the first time after a long time of keeping quiet, to stop keeping quiet? What happened next unfolded over 11 days, and I want you to understand that it happened quietly, without announcements, without any particular fanfare. Earl Hagedorn was not a man for speeches. He let machinery speak. It started with a phone call to Walt Gruber. Walt had a 1969 John Deere 4020 with a cracked injector return line and a secondary hydraulic leak that he'd been told by craters would cost $1,800 to fix. Earl drove over. He looked at it. He told Walt to come by his shop on Saturday. Saturday morning, Walt showed up at 8. Earl had already laid out the parts on his workbench, sourced the week before from a supplier in Ames. Total cost $83. Injector return line kit, hydraulic O-ring and seal set, tools laid out on a clean rag. They fixed it in 4 hours. Earl charged Walt $40 for the parts and nothing for the labor. Walt Gruber stood in Earl's barn afterward looking at the running tractor and was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you do this before?" he finally said. "Nobody asked," Earl said. By the following Saturday, Pete Lindemann's 806 International was in Earl's shop, a fuel injection timing issue that Craters had quoted at $900 and 2 weeks out. Earl fixed it in an afternoon for parts that cost $31. Word moves fast in a small county when the farm crisis has made every dollar feel like the last dollar. By the 3rd week of March, Earl had 6 tractors lined up outside his shop. Let me describe what that looked like. 6 machines, colors ranging from the green of John Deere to the red of International Harvester to the orange of Ali's Chalmers, sitting in the Iowa mud in the weak early spring sunlight, exhaust rising in the cold morning air. Dorothy was bringing out coffee in an extension cord-powered percolator. Sputnik the dog was moving between the machines with professional interest. Farmers who hadn't spoken more than seasonal pleasantries in years were standing in Earl's yard talking, not about prices, not about debt, not about the news from Des Moines about the farm bill, but about machinery, about what they knew, about what they'd fixed themselves in 1971 and forgotten they knew how to do. Now about the 4520. The county's spring planting equipment demonstration was held annually at the Boone County Fairgrounds, organized by the county extension office, usually in late April. Dealers set up. New equipment was displayed. It was half trade show, half social event, and in 1987 it had taken on a slightly desperate quality, because everyone knew the numbers and nobody wanted to talk about them directly. Gary Crater had arranged to display a brand new John Deere 4850, a $89,000 tractor, 4-wheel drive, the new Soundguard cab with air conditioning and a radio, 335 horsepower. It was genuinely a remarkable machine. Gary had it brought in on a flatbed the morning of the event, and it sat at the front of his display like an exclamation point. Earl showed up with his 4520 on a trailer behind his pickup. There were maybe 200 people at the fairgrounds that morning, farmers, their families, extension agents, a reporter from the Boone News-Republican. The April sky was high and pale blue, the kind of sky that promises warmth and doesn't quite deliver yet. The fairground grass was still brown and matted from winter. Gary Crater saw Earl pulling in. He watched him unhook the trailer, walk the 4520 off the ramps, park it in a space at the far end of the row. He watched Earl in the way you watch something that doesn't quite fit the category you've put it in. He walked over. Earl, he looked at the 4520. He knew what it was. Gary knew his tractors. That's a 4520. It is. Haven't seen one running in years. Most people haven't. Gary walked around it. He was doing the math in his head. You could see it. A machine nearly 20 years old, high-clearance configuration, turbo. He looked at the tires, the hydraulic connections, the cab. It was clean. It was very clean. "What are you asking for it?" he said. The question had a slight edge to it, a way of placing the machine in the category of for sale, which was also the category of finished, used up, on its way out. "Not for sale," Earl said. "Running well. Come back this afternoon." That afternoon, Earl did something that required planning he'd been doing quietly for 2 weeks. He'd arranged, through the extension office, a simple field demonstration, a half-acre plot adjacent to the fairgrounds, already tilled, available for equipment showcasing. He'd arranged for a fuel consumption monitor and a basic horsepower load test using a drag, the kind of practical measurement that farmers trusted more than brochures. The 4850 went first, beautiful machine, smooth. The crowd moved toward it with the reverence people give to new things. Gary narrated from the cab. The tractor moved through the test plot like it was thinking about it. Numbers were read off, good numbers. Then Earl drove the 4520 off the end of the line and into position. He didn't narrate, he just ran it. What happened in the next 20 minutes? Two people who were there described to the sources behind this story in almost identical terms without coordinating. They both used the word surprise. Not the surprise of a trick, but the surprise of something you'd forgotten was possible. The 4520 in Earl's rebuilt condition ran the same test plot at comparable horsepower output. Its fuel consumption numbers were better, a consequence of a full injection timing rebuild and a reconditioned turbo running at correct boost pressure. It didn't have the new cab, it didn't have the radio, it didn't have four-wheel drive. What it had was this: it had cost, between purchase price and 3 years of evening repairs, approximately $3,400 total. The 4850 beside it was $89,000. A farmer in the crowd, a man named Harlan Beets from the south end of the county, a man who had not made a joke at a public event in roughly 4 years, called out from somewhere in the middle of the group. "Earl, what do you owe on that thing?" "Nothing," Earl said from the cab. The crowd was quiet for a second. And then Harlan Beets laughed, not at Earl, not at Gary, just laughed, the laugh of a man who had just seen something true. Gary Crater stood at the edge of his display area for a long time that afternoon. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and he watched the cluster of people around Earl Hagedorn's 1968 tractor, and his face went through several expressions that don't translate well into words. Not humiliation exactly, not anger, something more complicated. He had not done anything dishonest in his own mind. The farm equipment industry had moved in a direction and he had moved with it. Newer equipment, higher margins, service dependencies, that was the business. That was the whole business. But watching 200 Iowa farmers stand around a 19-year-old tractor that a man had fixed in his evenings for $3,400, with planting season 6 weeks away and bank debt hanging over half those farms like weather, Gary Crater understood, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, what he had become in the lives of the people he'd grown up alongside. Not a villain exactly, just the wrong kind of answer to the wrong kind of question. Denton Pryor, his service manager, walked up beside him. "Good turnout," Denton said. Gary didn't say anything. "You want me to bring the truck around?" Gary watched Earl Hagedorn climb down from the cab of the 4520, shake hands with Walt Gruber, get handed a cup of coffee by a woman Earl's age who seemed to be somebody's wife. He watched the crowd stay around that machine, not the new machine, not the $89,000 machine, but around a rebuilt tractor and the farmer who knew what it was. "Yeah," Gary said, "bring the truck around." He didn't say much else for the rest of the afternoon. What happened in Boone County after that spring is not a simple story, and I won't pretend it is. Earl Hagedorn did not open a repair shop in any formal sense. He didn't incorporate, didn't advertise, didn't hang a sign. What he did was continue doing what he'd been doing, fixing machines for neighbors, teaching what he knew, charging for parts and almost never for labor. Through the spring and summer of 1987, somewhere between 15 and 20 farmers in the county brought equipment to Earl's barn. A few of them learned alongside him. A few of those men began doing the same thing for others. There is a name for what Earl was doing, though nobody used it at the time. It's called a community repair network, and agricultural economists would begin documenting their emergence across the rural Midwest in the late 1980s as survival responses to the service monopoly model. Earl didn't have a name for it, he just called it helping. The 4520 went into Earl's regular planting rotation in the spring of 1987 and ran without notable issues through 1991, when Earl finally retired it, not because it failed, but because Dorothy's health required him to cut the operation to a scale where one tractor was enough. About the bill. Earl never paid the $2,527 electronic calibration charge. Crater Farm Equipment eventually wrote it off. This is not remarkable. Dealers wrote off disputed charges regularly during the farm crisis. What is slightly remarkable is the letter Gary Crater sent Earl in October of 1987, 7 months after the fairgrounds demonstration. Nobody outside Earl's family has read that letter. Dorothy Hagedorn mentioned it once in a conversation years later. She said it wasn't an apology exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement. A man trying to say, in the careful way that proud men have of saying things, that he had understood something he hadn't understood before. Earl, according to Dorothy, read it once, put it in the box with his notebooks, and didn't mention it again. Gary Crater restructured his service pricing in 1988, not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably. His labor rate came down. The phantom line items disappeared. Whether this was because of Earl or because of larger market pressure or because of something Gary worked out on his own that October is impossible to say with certainty. Maybe all three. Crater Farm Equipment survived the farm crisis, one of the few dealerships in that part of Iowa that did. Whether that had anything to do with what happened in 1987 is something Gary Crater would have to tell you himself, and he never did. Earl Hagedorn continued farming until 1994. He sold the home farm to a neighbor's son, not to a corporation, not to an outside investor, which in 1994 in Iowa was becoming increasingly rare. The sale price was below market. Earl's explanation, when asked, was brief. That family belongs on that land. He and Dorothy moved to a small house in Ogden. He kept the workshop. He kept fixing things. Let me tell you what the people who knew Earl Hagedorn say about him, because it matters. They don't talk about the fairgrounds demonstration as much as you might expect. What they talk about, the thing that comes up more than anything else, is the way he taught. Not lectures, not formal instruction, just standing beside someone, working a problem, handing them the right tool without making them feel like they should have already known which tool it was. Harlan Beets, the man who laughed that afternoon, sent his youngest son to spend 2 weeks in Earl's workshop in the summer of 1989. That young man, whose name was Terry Beets, went on to become one of the most sought-after independent equipment repair technicians in central Iowa. He runs a business today, Terry Beets Agricultural Services, based in Ames, with 4 employees and a waiting list. Terry Beets has an old photograph on the wall of his office. It's Earl Hagedorn standing beside the 4520 at the 1987 Boone County spring demonstration. Somebody with a simple camera caught the moment just after the run. Earl is holding a coffee cup. He's looking at the tractor, not at the camera. He looks like a man who is thinking about the next thing. Walt Gruber, who died in 2009, was eulogized by his son as a man who had taught him that knowing your own machinery is knowing your own dignity. His son credited Earl Hagedorn by name. The 4520 sits in a private collection in Grundy County today. It was purchased in 1998 at the Hagedorn Estate Dispersal. Dorothy had kept it, even after the farm was sold, even after it had no practical use, because she said Earl loved it the way some men love their best work. The man who bought it, a collector named Dennis Voss, had it appraised on purchase. The appraiser put it at $14,000. Voss laughed when he heard that. "I would have paid double," he said. Let me pause here one final time and ask you something. What do we lose when we lose the knowledge of how to fix our own things? I don't mean this as a mechanical question. I mean it as something deeper. There is a kind of confidence, a specific, grounded, unshakable kind of confidence that comes from understanding the systems you depend on. From knowing not just that the machine runs, but why it runs and what to do when it doesn't. There is a freedom in that knowledge that no service contract can replicate, no extended warranty can purchase. Earl Hagedorn was not a hero in any conventional sense. He didn't save his county. He didn't start a movement. He didn't even win a fight, not exactly. He just refused to pay for a service that couldn't be performed on a machine that didn't have the systems to receive it, and then he went home and helped his neighbors with what he knew. But that refusal and what followed from it is a story that echoes. We live in an age of increasing complexity, increasing dependency, increasing cost. The machines we rely on, farm equipment, cars, computers, phones, are designed with deliberate obstacles to self-repair. Some of those obstacles are safety-based, some are economic, some are both. The question Earl Hagedorn was living out, without framing it as a question, just living it, is one we are still living with. At what point does the cost of dependency outweigh the convenience of it? Earl's answer was practical. He looked at what the machine actually needed, compared it to what was being charged for what the machine actually needed, and when those two numbers diverged past the point of reason, he went to his workshop and addressed the gap with what he knew. Not anger, not ideology, just competence offered freely in the service of people who needed it. There is an old idea in agricultural communities, older than America really, that knowledge shared is not knowledge diminished. That teaching your neighbor to do what you know how to do does not make you less valuable. It makes the community more resilient. Earl understood this. The men who stood in his barn on those Saturday mornings understood it. The knowledge passed between them in the smell of oil and cold coffee and engine exhaust was not just mechanical. It was relational. It was a kind of mutual assurance against the future. Earl Hagedorn died in 2003. He was 69. He had spent the years since retiring in that workshop in Ogden, fixing things for anyone who brought them to him. His obituary in the Boone News-Republican was 9 lines long. It listed his survivors, his church membership, his years of farming. It did not mention the 4520. It did not mention the fairgrounds. It did not mention the 12 or 15 or 20 people whose planting seasons he had saved with his knowledge and his time. Most of the important things about a life don't make it into the 9 lines. But here on this channel, in this small way, let me say this. There was a man in Boone County, Iowa in 1987 who knew what his machine needed and what it didn't need, who knew the difference between a real bill and a dishonest one, who kept quiet about what he knew for a long time and then, when the moment came, simply stopped keeping quiet. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he went to his workshop, got out his tools, and got to work. The crowd went quiet that afternoon in April, not because they were shocked, not because they were embarrassed for Gary Crater, though some of them probably were, but because they recognized something they'd almost forgotten. They recognized competence offered without arrogance, skill shared without conditions, an old machine running. In 1987, in Iowa, in the mud of the fairgrounds, in the pale April sun, Earl Hagedorn drank his coffee and looked at his tractor and let it speak for itself. That is enough, that is more than enough. Don't overlook the man in the old coat, don't write off the machine under the tarp, and never, ever mistake silence for ignorance. Historical context is real. The farm crisis of the 1980s, agricultural equipment dependency trends, and independent repair economics are documented history. Characters, dialogue, and specific events depicted in this story are dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below about a time someone's quiet knowledge changed something for you. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer. New stories every week.